Our land has been in the family for over 100 years. My great-grandfather purchased these 80 acres with money saved from 3 jobs and a dream of self-sufficiency that seemed to flow in our bloodline. The weathered barn that stands at the center of our property is older than any building for miles around, its foundation stones laid by hands that believed in building things to last. I grew up watching the seasons change across our fields, learning the rhythms of rural life that modern convenience has nearly erased from American memory. The smell of fresh-cut hay in summer, the sound of rain on the barn roof during spring storms, the quiet beauty of snow-covered pastures in winter. These experiences shaped not just my childhood, but my understanding of what matters in life. The barn itself holds more than just equipment and occasional livestock. Its walls contain our history. The east beam bears notches marking the height of every child in our family for 4 generations. The loft still holds great-grandmother's hope chest alongside Grandpa's military footlocker from his service days. Each weathered board and rusty nail tells part of our story. Grandpa, now in his 80s, remains the guardian of this legacy. His hands, knotted with arthritis but still remarkably strong, continue the work his father taught him. His eyes, faded blue but missing nothing, scan the property each morning as if communicating with the land itself. He speaks little but carries himself with the quiet dignity of a man who has earned his place in the world through honest work and unwavering principles. The trouble began 3 years ago when the Wilson property to our east was sold to developers. Where there had once been 60 acres of cornfields, construction crews built 96 identical homes with postage stamp yards and names like Meadow View, despite the conspicuous absence of both meadows and views. The Wilsons had been good neighbors for decades. When they reluctantly sold after health problems made farming impossible, they apologized to Grandpa as if they had committed a personal betrayal. "Progress marches on," Grandpa had told them without bitterness, though I saw the concern in his eyes. Within months of the new houses being occupied, bright blue signs appeared along our property line. Meadowview Estates Homeowners Association. Property restrictions enforced. The signs seemed to watch us accusingly, as if our generations of stewardship were suddenly inadequate compared to their fresh bylaws and regulations. The first hint of trouble came when Grandpa replaced some rotted siding on the barn with boards weathered to match the rest. A woman in a crisp blazer appeared at our door the very next day with a clipboard and a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning. I am Victoria Chambers, head of the Meadowview Estates HOA Compliance Committee. I need to inform you that any structural modifications require prior approval from our Architectural Review Board." She handed Grandpa a thick packet of papers. "These guidelines will bring you up to code." Grandpa took the packet without opening it. "This property predates your development by nearly a century and is not part of your association," he said simply. Her smile tightened as she gestured toward the row of blue signs. "The entire area falls under our covenant now. We need uniformity to protect property values," she replied. "Your—" She paused, looking past him at our barn with thinly veiled distaste. "Rustic aesthetic impacts the marketability of our community." That was the first skirmish in what would become an escalating battle between two fundamentally opposed views of property rights. Our family land, worked and loved for generations, versus their laminated rulebooks and property value spreadsheets. Neither side understanding how the other could possibly see the world so differently. The certified letters began arriving weekly, each one thicker than the last, each tone more threatening. I watched Grandpa read them at the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression growing stonier with each envelope he opened. unsightly agricultural equipment visible from community roads. Unpermitted livestock housing requires immediate remediation. Failure to maintain aesthetic standards as outlined in Section 437. Final notice before enforcement action. The HOA seemed to invent new violations faster than we could possibly address them, even if we had been inclined to comply. The absurdity reached a peak when they demanded we repaint our 120-year-old barn in approved Meadow View Estate's historical red 37, which, ironically, was almost identical to its current weathered color, just glossier, and without the character earned through decades of sun and rain. Mom suggested we attend the next HOA meeting to reason with them directly. There has to be some compromise, she said, always the diplomat in the family. Dad and Grandpa exchanged skeptical glances, but agreed it was worth trying. The community center buzzed with conversation that fell to whispers when our family entered. We stood out immediately. Grandpa in his clean but well-worn overalls, Dad in his work clothes, hands bearing the calluses of actual labor. Mom and I dressed more formally, hoping to bridge the cultural gap that felt wider with each passing moment. Victoria Chambers sat at the center of a long table at the front, flanked by other board members. Her expression when she saw us was that of someone discovering an unpleasant odor but too polite to mention it directly. "We are here to discuss the notices," Mom began after we were recognized. "Our property has historical status with the county and several exemptions from zoning regulations that existed before your development." Victoria cut her off. "We are well aware of outdated permits, Mrs. Johnson. However, the covenant supersedes prior arrangements. Your property affects all 96 homeowners who have invested their life savings in this community." Dad stepped forward. "The barn has stood for over a century. Your houses have been there less than 3 years. Seems to me you bought property knowing full well what was next door." A balding man at the end of the board table leaned forward. I would later learn this was Richard Prentice, Victoria's second-in-command, and a real estate investor with stakes in 3 other developments in the county. "The issue is not the existence of your structures," he said, making the barn sound like some questionable architectural experiment. "The issue is bringing them up to community standards. Property values in Meadow View estates are projected to increase 14% annually, but only if we maintain uniformity." Grandpa, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "My deed predates your association. My land is not subject to your rules. The county assessor and zoning board have confirmed this in writing." He placed a folder on their table. "Here are the documents proving our exemption." Victoria barely glanced at the folder. "These will need to be reviewed by our legal committee. In the meantime, compliance is expected." What followed was 30 minutes of circular arguments. The HOA talked about community standards, uniformity, and property values. We talked about history, rights, and reasonable boundaries. 2 worldviews colliding without hope of reconciliation. As we left the meeting, I noticed Richard and Victoria huddled with a third man, glancing in our direction. There was something in their expressions that went beyond mere regulatory concern. This felt personal somehow. The following weeks brought escalation. SUVs with the HOA logo began appearing at our property edge daily. People with clipboards photographed our barn, our equipment, even our family garden. When Dad approached one, they claimed to be documenting ongoing violations from public right-of-way. The mail brought new threats, increasing fines we had no intention of paying, warnings about enforcement actions without specifying what those might be. references to obscure county codes that, when we researched them, either did not exist or did not apply to agricultural properties like ours. "They are trying to wear us down," Mom said one evening as we sorted through the latest batch of certified letters. Grandpa nodded slowly. "That is how it works now. They do not take what is yours outright. They just make keeping it so miserable that you give up." He looked around at the kitchen where 4 generations of our family had gathered for meals. "But they do not understand what this land means to us. They think everything has a price." None of us realized then how quickly their pressure tactics would escalate, or how dramatically Grandpa would respond when they crossed the final line. The morning began like most spring days on our property. Dad was repairing the irrigation system for the east field. Mom was planting this year's vegetable garden. I was helping Grandpa clean and oil the antique tractor he had restored decades ago, a labor of love that connected him to his own father who had purchased it new in 1953. The day was warm for April, the kind that hints at summer while spring wildflowers still dot the fields. Birds called from the old oak trees that lined our driveway. The familiar rhythm of rural life hummed around us, timeless and grounding amid the stress of our ongoing HOA battle. Around 11, Grandpa straightened up from the tractor engine and looked toward the barn. He stood motionless for a moment, head slightly tilted like a bird listening for distant danger. Something had caught his attention that my younger eyes had missed. "Did you leave the barn door open this morning?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. I looked where he was looking. The massive sliding door stood open about 2 feet, a slash of darkness against the web. Red wood. "No, sir. I made sure it was latched when I got the oil." Grandpa wiped his hands slowly on a rag, his movements deliberate. There was something in his manner that made me set down my tools and watch him. Without a word, he began walking toward the barn, and I followed a step behind. As we approached, voices drifted from inside. Unfamiliar voices speaking in the clipped, authoritative tones of people accustomed to being obeyed. A camera flash pulsed from within, momentarily illuminating the interior darkness. Grandpa slowed his pace but continued forward, his boots making no sound on the soft spring earth. When we reached the partially open door, he paused to listen. I stood beside him, barely breathing, as the conversation inside became clear. "This entire structure is a safety hazard." The voice was female, precise, familiar. "Victoria Chambers. Document the exposed wiring there and the unprotected equipment. Make sure to get the safety violations with the hayloft ladder." "What about all this junk?" A male voice I did not recognize. "Should I photograph these storage violations?" "Everything. The board wants comprehensive documentation for the enforcement action. They have ignored too many notices." A third voice chimed in. "Some of this stuff looks pretty old, maybe even valuable to collectors. That might explain why they are so resistant to proper storage regulations." I felt Grandpa stiffen beside me. They were handling our family heirlooms. I glanced up at his face and saw something I had rarely witnessed. Anger. Not the flash-fire temper that some men display, but something deeper and more controlled. A slow-burning outrage that changed his entire bearing. He stepped through the door and I followed. The sunlight streaming in behind us illuminated the scene like a stage. Victoria Chambers stood in the center of our barn, clipboard in hand, directing 2 men who were photographing and making notes. One was Richard Prentice from the HOA board. The other was a younger man in khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo, whom I had seen driving their patrol car. All around were the treasures of our family history. great-grandmother's rocking chair that had soothed 4 generations of babies, the trunk containing Grandpa's military uniform and medals, the handmade tools that had worked this land before modern equipment existed, all being examined, documented, and dismissed as junk and violations by strangers who had entered our private space without permission. For a moment, no one spoke. Victoria recovered first, straightening her posture and adopting her official tone. "Mr. Johnson, we are conducting an inspection as outlined in the notices you have received. Your continued noncompliance has necessitated direct intervention." Grandpa's voice was quiet but carried clearly in the barn's acoustics. "You are trespassing on private property. You have no authority here, no right to touch our belongings." Richard stepped forward, his manner condescending. "As we have explained repeatedly, your property falls under HOA jurisdiction. Section 8.3 of the Covenant gives the Compliance Committee authority to inspect violations after proper notification. My property is exempt from your covenant. The county has confirmed this in writing." Grandpa's calm was unnerving compared to the nervous energy radiating from the intruders. "You broke into a private building and are handling private property without consent." Victoria's smile was tight. "The door was unlocked. We are merely documenting violations for the good of the community. If you would prefer not to be present for the inspection, you are free to leave." The audacity of her statement hung in the air, telling us we could leave our own barn while they continued their unauthorized intrusion. In that moment, something shifted in Grandpa's expression. Anyone who knew him well would recognize it as the look he got when a decision had been made from which he would not be moved. "Jackson," he said to me, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face, "go tell your father what is happening here. Ask him to bring the padlock from the workshop." I hesitated only briefly before slipping out the door and running toward the fields where Dad was working. Behind me, I heard Victoria's voice rising in protest, but Grandpa's response was too quiet to make out. Whatever he said, it was clearly not what the HOA patrol had expected to hear. What I did not realize then was that Grandpa had just drawn a line that would change everything. Not just for our family, but for the entire community. I returned with Dad to find a scene that would be etched in my memory forever. Grandpa stood with his back against the main barn door, which was now fully closed. His posture was relaxed but unmovable, like one of the ancient oak trees that dotted our property. The 3 HOA representatives had gathered in the center of the barn, their earlier confidence visibly shaken. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Victoria was saying, her voice higher than her usual controlled tone. "You cannot restrict our movement. We are here on official HOA business." "You are here without permission or authority," Grandpa replied evenly. "That makes you trespassers under county law." Richard stepped forward, his face flushed. "This is ridiculous. Open the door immediately or we will be forced to take legal action." Dad assessed the situation quickly, his expression hardening as he realized what was happening. Without a word, he moved to the smaller side door and stood before it, mirroring Grandpa's calm but unmistakably firm stance. "What is going on?" I whispered to Dad. "Your grandfather is teaching them about boundaries," he replied quietly. Victoria noticed the heavy padlock in my father's hand and her eyes widened. "You cannot be serious. This is false imprisonment. We will have you arrested." Grandpa shook his head slowly. "No, Miss Chambers. What you have done is breaking and entering. What I am doing is securing my property and calling the proper authorities to handle trespassers." With deliberate movements, Grandpa removed his cell phone from his pocket. The simple action seemed to trigger a shift in the atmosphere. The HOA patrol, so accustomed to wielding authority over nervous homeowners, suddenly appeared uncertain. "Sheriff Parker, please," Grandpa said into the phone, his voice as calm as if he were ordering coffee. "This is Edward Johnson over at the old Johnson place." He paused, listening. "Yes, Earl, good to hear your voice too. I have a situation here that requires your attention. 3 individuals have entered my barn without permission and are refusing to leave." Victoria stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Let me speak to him. This is all a misunderstanding." Grandpa continued as if she had not spoken. "They claim to be from the Meadowview HOA and say they have authority to inspect my property." "Yes. Yes, that is correct. No, they did not have permission to enter. Yes, I have already informed them of the trespass." While Grandpa spoke with the sheriff, Dad moved to each window, closing the wooden shutters that normally stayed open during spring days. The barn grew dimmer, the only significant light now coming from the small gaps in the wall boards and around the door frames. Dust motes danced in the slanting rays, giving the scene an almost theatrical quality. The younger HOA representative, who had been silent until now, looked nervously between his colleagues. "Maybe we should just leave and come back with proper documentation." "We are not going anywhere," Victoria snapped. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. They are trying to frighten us because they know they are in violation." Richard paced nervously, his polished loafers raising small clouds of dust from the barn floor. "This is absurd. Do you know who I am? I have connections with the county commissioner. This will not end well for you." Grandpa finished his call and returned the phone to his pocket. His expression remained unchanged. "Sheriff Parker will be here as soon as he finishes with a traffic accident on Route 16. He suggested everyone stay put until he arrives to sort things out." Dad took the padlock and secured the side door with a decisive click that echoed in the barn. He then walked to Grandpa and spoke quietly. "Mom and Jackson should wait outside. This might get complicated." Grandpa nodded. "Jackson, go help your grandmother bring some chairs. It might be a while before the sheriff gets here." "You cannot do this." Victoria's voice had lost its authoritative edge and now held a note of growing concern. "You cannot lock us in here." "I am not locking you in," Grandpa replied. "I am securing my property with you in it until the proper authorities arrive to address your trespassing. There is a difference." As I slipped out through the main door that Dad temporarily opened, I heard Richard's voice rising in pitch. "This is outrageous. I demand you release us immediately. Do you have any idea the legal consequences you are facing?" The last thing I saw before the heavy door slid completely closed was Grandpa settling himself on an old milking stool, his posture suggesting he was prepared to wait as long as necessary. The loud thunk of the wooden beam sliding into place across the door brackets was followed by Dad securing it with the padlock. Outside in the spring sunshine, the contrast between the tense scene in the barn and the peaceful farm around us seemed almost surreal. Mom was already approaching with folding chairs, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Is Grandpa really keeping them in there?" she asked Dad. "He is keeping them exactly where the sheriff can find them," Dad replied, taking the chairs. "Exactly where they put themselves when they decided our property rights did not matter." The minutes stretched into hours as we waited for Sheriff Parker to arrive. Dad had received a call that the accident on Route 16 was more serious than initially reported, and it would likely be afternoon before the sheriff could make it to our property. This news, when relayed through the barn door to our unwilling guests, was met with outrage that gradually transformed into bargaining. "Mr. Johnson, be reasonable," Victoria called through a crack in the boards after the first hour passed. "We can discuss this like civilized people. There is no need to involve law enforcement." Grandpa sat in a folding chair about 10 feet from the barn door, seemingly content to wait. The time for discussion was before you entered private property without permission. Now it is a matter for the sheriff. Another hour passed. The spring day grew warmer. Mom brought out lemonade and sandwiches for our impromptu vigil. Neighbors from nearby farms, curious about the unfamiliar vehicles parked by our property, began to stop by. Each time, Dad quietly explained the situation, and each time the neighbor would nod in understanding and often pull up a chair to join the wait. Richard's voice replaced Victoria's at the door crack. His tone had shifted from threatening to persuasive. "Listen, we may have been overzealous in our approach. The association can compensate you for any inconvenience, perhaps a waiver of compliance deadlines, or even a financial consideration. Are you attempting to bribe your way out of a criminal trespass, Mr. Prentice?" Grandpa's voice carried just enough to be heard by those of us nearby, but not so loud as to sound accusatory. Richard's response was immediate and flustered. "Of course not. I am suggesting a mutual resolution that benefits everyone involved." "The resolution is simple," Grandpa replied. "The sheriff arrives, documents what happened here today, and the law takes its course." By early afternoon, the inside of the barn must have grown uncomfortable. The younger HOA representative, who we learned was named Taylor, spoke through the door next. His voice lacked the authoritative tone of his colleagues. "Sir, I need to use the bathroom. This is inhumane." Mom looked concerned at this, her natural compassion surfacing despite her anger at the intrusion. She approached the door. "There is an outhouse 50 yards behind the barn. If you need to use it, we can arrange that." After a whispered consultation inside, Victoria responded with forced politeness. "That would be appreciated." Dad temporarily removed the beam while Grandpa stood watch with several of our neighbors. Taylor emerged, blinking in the sunlight, looking decidedly less crisp than when he had entered our barn. Under the watchful eyes of Dad and 2 neighboring farmers, he was escorted to the outhouse and back without incident. During this brief reprieve, I noticed Taylor studying our property with new interest, his eyes taking in the carefully maintained gardens, the ancient trees, the small family cemetery on the hill where generations of Johnsons rested. Something in his expression had changed from bureaucratic detachment to thoughtful consideration. As he was escorted back to the barn, he paused near Grandpa. "I did not know this land had been in your family for so long," he said quietly. Grandpa nodded. "Since 1906, every structure built by hand, every tree planted with purpose." Something flickered in Taylor's eyes before he was returned to the barn, and the beam was replaced. I wondered if perhaps one of our captives was beginning to see beyond property values and compliance codes. As the afternoon wore on, the conversations through the door revealed more than perhaps the HOA patrol intended. During a particularly heated exchange between Victoria and Richard, when they thought their voices were not carrying outside, we learned the truth behind their aggressive enforcement. "This is your fault," Victoria hissed at Richard. "You promised the investors that all adjacent properties would be brought into compliance or purchased for expansion." "How was I supposed to know these people would be so stubborn?" Richard shot back. "Everyone has a price. The holding company needs this land rezoned by September, or the financing falls through for Phase 3. Well, your brilliant inspection idea has us locked in a barn facing trespassing charges, Victoria replied. The old man will never sell now. This revelation spread quickly among our growing gathering of neighbors. The HOA's persistent harassment had never been about property values or community standards. It had been about forcing us off our land for development expansion. Around 4 o'clock, we heard a different voice from inside. Taylor again, but speaking to his colleagues rather than to us. Did either of you actually check if this property is legally covered by our covenant? Because I am not sure it is. Victoria's dismissive response was cut short by the sound of tires on gravel. Sheriff Parker's cruiser had finally arrived, followed by a deputy in a second vehicle. The moment of reckoning had come. Sheriff Earl Parker had known our family my entire life. He had attended the same school as my father, and his father had worked summers on our farm as a teenager. He was fair-minded and respected throughout the county, known for handling disputes with an even hand regardless of personal connections. As he stepped from his cruiser, his weathered face revealed nothing beyond professional interest. His deputy, a younger woman named Rodriguez, stood slightly behind him with a notepad ready. "Afternoon, Edward," the sheriff said to Grandpa, removing his hat briefly in greeting. "Quite a gathering you have here." Grandpa rose from his chair and shook the sheriff's hand. "Thank you for coming, Earl. Sorry to take you away from more important matters." The sheriff surveyed the scene. The locked barn, the cluster of neighbors and family members, the HOA vehicles parked nearby. "Why do not you tell me exactly what happened here?" Grandpa explained the situation methodically, without embellishment or accusation. How we had discovered the HOA representatives inside our barn without permission. How they had been handling family property and taking photographs. How they had refused to leave when informed they were trespassing. How we had secured the barn and called the authorities rather than escalating the confrontation. When he finished, Sheriff Parker nodded thoughtfully. "And the individuals are still inside?" "Yes, sir," Dad confirmed. "3 of them. We have allowed bathroom breaks under supervision but otherwise kept the building secure until you arrived." The sheriff turned to Deputy Rodriguez. "Make note of the time and circumstances." He then approached the barn door and identified himself loudly. "This is Sheriff Parker. I am going to ask you to remain calm while we sort this situation out." Victoria's voice came immediately, high with indignation. "Sheriff, we have been held against our will for hours. This is kidnapping or false imprisonment. We want these people arrested immediately." "Ma'am, I understand you are upset. I will hear everyone's account. For now, please remain patient while I gather the facts." The sheriff turned back to Grandpa. "You mentioned property exemptions and boundaries. Do you have documentation of your property status?" Grandpa nodded and asked Mom to retrieve the file from the house. While we waited, the sheriff spoke quietly with Dad about the timeline of events. Deputy Rodriguez walked the perimeter of the barn, making notes and taking photographs. When Mom returned with the folder, Sheriff Parker reviewed the documents carefully. Property deeds dating back to 1906. Agricultural exemptions filed with the county. Most importantly, a letter from the county zoning board dated just 6 months earlier, specifically confirming that our property was not legally subject to the Meadowview Estates HOA covenant due to its historical agricultural designation and pre-existing boundaries. The sheriff studied these papers before nodding to Dad. "Let them out. I need to speak with them directly." Dad removed the padlock and slid the wooden beam aside. The barn door opened to reveal 3 disheveled and indignant HOA representatives blinking in the late afternoon sunlight. Victoria immediately stepped forward, straightening her blazer in a futile attempt to restore her authoritative appearance. "Sheriff, I demand these people be arrested immediately. We have been illegally detained for over 5 hours." Sheriff Parker held up his hand. "Ma'am, I will need you to calm down and answer some questions first, starting with why you were inside private property without the owner's permission." "We were conducting an inspection, as is our right under the HOA covenant," Richard interjected. "These people have been ignoring violation notices for months." The sheriff held up the zoning board letter. "Are you aware of this exemption ruling from the county?" Victoria and Richard exchanged glances. "That ruling is under appeal," Victoria said quickly. "Until a final determination is made, the property remains subject to association rules." Deputy Rodriguez, who had been examining the barn door, called the sheriff over. She pointed to distinct marks on the frame. "Forced entry, sir. The latch shows signs of tampering." The situation shifted palpably. The sheriff turned back to the HOA representatives, his expression now decidedly cooler. "So you entered a private structure, on private property that has a county exemption from your jurisdiction, without permission, potentially by forcing the door, and then refused to leave when asked by the legal owner." Taylor, the youngest of the three, stepped slightly away from his colleagues. "Sir, I was told this was a routine inspection that had been cleared through proper channels. I was not aware of any exemption status." Sheriff Parker mumbled. "Do a note before addressing all three. I need to see identification from each of you. Then I need to know who made the decision to enter this structure and under what authority." What followed was a revealing unraveling. As the sheriff questioned them separately, the unified front collapsed. Richard blamed Victoria for assuring him they had legal authority to enter the property. Victoria claimed Richard had insisted the inspection was necessary for developer negotiations she was not fully privy to. Taylor admitted it was his first month on the job, and he had simply been following orders from his superiors. The sheriff had each of them provide formal statements while Deputy Rodriguez photographed the barn, documenting both the forced entry point and the family heirlooms that had been handled and photographed without permission. Most damning was when the sheriff examined Victoria's clipboard and found not just violation notices but property valuation estimates and notes about acquisition strategy and pressure points for motivated seller conversion. As the statements concluded, the sheriff addressed the three HOA representatives formally. "Based on the evidence and statements, I am documenting this as a criminal trespass. The county prosecutor will determine if additional charges are warranted regarding the forced entry and potential harassment." Victoria began to protest, but the sheriff continued. "You are free to leave, but I strongly advise against any further contact with this property or its owners outside of legal channels. Deputy Rodriguez will escort you to your vehicles." As they were led away, our neighbors who had gathered throughout the afternoon stood in silent witness. The HOA patrol that had terrorized many of them with petty violations and threats now walked with heads bowed, their authority stripped away by the simple application of actual law. News travels quickly in small communities. By evening, the story of Grandpa locking the HOA patrol in our barn had spread throughout the county. By the following day, it had reached local news outlets. Within a week, it had become something of a legend. The legal consequences unfolded with satisfying swiftness. The county prosecutor filed criminal trespass charges against Victoria and Richard. The investigation revealed a paper trail connecting them to a development company that had been systematically targeting properties adjacent to Meadowview Estates for future expansion. Their aggressive enforcement of HOA rules against non-member properties was part of a documented strategy to devalue land and pressure owners to sell. Taylor, the junior member, received immunity in exchange for his testimony about the broader pattern of harassment. He resigned from the HOA patrol and later told us he was pursuing a degree in land conservation, his perspective forever changed by that day in our barn. The most immediate impact was on our neighbors. Many had suffered similar harassment but lacked our property's historical exemption status. Families who had endured petty fines for vegetable gardens deemed unsightly, or children's play equipment labeled as non-conforming structures, suddenly found themselves empowered to question the HOA's authority. 2 weeks after the incident, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. The attendance was unprecedented. Homeowners who had never participated in association governance packed the community center, many standing along walls when seating ran out. The board president, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, began with a prepared statement. The board wishes to express its deepest regret for the unauthorized actions taken by certain overzealous committee members. These individuals acted without board approval and have been removed from their positions. The association is implementing new oversight procedures to ensure all enforcement activities comply with legal boundaries. The carefully worded apology might have sufficed in earlier times, but something had changed in the community. One by one, homeowners stood to describe their own experiences with intimidation and unreasonable enforcement. Many expressed shock at learning about the connection to development interests that had never been disclosed to residents. By meeting's end, 3 board members had resigned, including the president. A new interim board was elected with a mandate to completely overhaul the covenant and enforcement policies. Their first official act was to pass a resolution formally acknowledging our property's boundaries and exemption status. For our family, the vindication brought a quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. Grandpa, never one to gloat, simply returned to the seasonal work of the farm as if nothing extraordinary had happened. When neighbors stopped by to express admiration for his stand, he would deflect with simple wisdom. All I did was insist on what was right. Nothing brave about that. The barn itself took and new significance. What had been a utilitarian structure, albeit one rich with family history, became something of a symbol. Neighboring farmers who had been considering selling to developers reconsidered, finding renewed pride in their agricultural heritage. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome came 6 months later, when the County Historical Society officially designated our barn as a historic landmark, protecting it from future development pressure regardless of changing zoning laws. The ceremony was attended by many of our neighbors, some from the HOA development who had come to appreciate the value of history and tradition alongside property values. As summer turned to fall, Grandpa and I sat on the porch watching sunset paint the old barn in golden light. My own children played nearby, too young to understand the full significance of what had happened, but somehow,